Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I thank the organizers from Channel A Chairs Forum for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I want to thank Dr. Bong, who will be the moderator. I've long admired him, and he's a fellow alumnus of University of Pennsylvania. I wanted to thank Prime Minister Kim, Ambassador Mitsushima, DCM Fang, and leaders of the National Assembly, former ministers. I'm honored by your presence, and I'm honored by the presence of all the other distinguished guests here today. I wanted to start my discussion with a broad overview of my view of the relationship between economics and security in East Asia since the 1990s. I'll then talk about some of the recent forces that have made economic patterns in the region more contentious and that could impact security politics in the region as well. I'll focus on Chinese and U.S. policies. I'm a China expert by training, and the impact of U.S.-China strategic competition on regional economic and security patterns and the implications of those changes on third countries like Korea. I'll conclude with some recommendations for Korean business leaders on how best to navigate this changing environment and to maintain strong economic relations with the United States and help protect the Republic of Korea's economic and security interests. So first, I'll talk about globalization, trade, and peace. And I just want to say at the outset, I'm an unusual American these days in that I believe in free trade. And I believe that free trade has been not only good for economics for the United States and other economic partners around the world, but it's also been a positive factor in the security realm for peace. When we look at the map of East Asia, I would say it is remarkable that there is a basic fact that is unusual in human history, and that is that there's been no interstate war in East Asia since 1979 when China invaded Vietnam. That's a very long period of peace in a region that has many sovereignty disputes, has very different forms of government, has unsettled legacies of history from World War II, and has witnessed major power shifts between the great powers in the region. All of those things are factors that political scientists like myself consider to be forces for instability, yet we've had no interstate war in East Asia since 1979. I believe that transnational production of goods and the deep interdependence in this region is one of the reasons why there has not been a war in this region since 1979. It's difficult to prove that. There are obviously other factors, and I'll talk about them, including the U.S. military presence in this region. And this interdependence is historically unprecedented in a way. We've had interdependence before. Nations in this region have long been trade dependent, but they used to, in the 1980s and 1990s, export to exterior markets more than they were trading with each other within the region. And there was a big moment in the middle of the 2000s, around 2005, in which trade within East Asia surpassed in value trade with the outside world. And this trend has deepened for the next 10 years or so and has run into challenges more recently. What this interdependence formed was transnational production of final manufactured goods. That became the norm in the region, where parts were being transferred between the countries for final assembly and sometimes sent out to countries in the region, sometimes sent outside. This has been a very productive form of production that has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty, a level of poverty that most Americans can't understand. But it is also very fragile. And my thesis is that this very fragile but very productive form of production would be severely damaged by any kind of military conflict. And I believe that most leaders in the region have known that. And that is one of the reasons that these many disputes that exist, political disputes, sovereignty disputes between the actors, have not escalated into conflict. Again, not the only reason, but a major reason. There have been real challenges to globalization and interdependence in recent years, and quite famously, my own country, the United States, has moved away from its leadership role on free trade, beginning in 2017 in the first Trump administration. But in my opinion, long before the first Trump administration came into office, China had been taking measures that harmed this type of international production and had reduced the kind of interdependence that had produced the peace. And I want to talk about that first, and then I will talk about the U.S. policies. There have been a series of problematic policies in China on the economic front. These are not just the views of Americans, and that's always a good test, because Americans can sometimes focus on China, and we'll talk about that later with Dr. Bong. But when multiple countries feel the same way about Chinese policies, there's a great veracity to the criticism. And the policies that are problematic are subsidies from the government for industries that are anti-competitive for foreigners, overcapacity, which flows from those subsidies and those government policies in certain key industries, programs to replace foreign suppliers in the international production chain. Remember, I said the transnational production chain was a source of peace. China has been replacing foreign suppliers in that transnational production chain. There have been intellectual property rights issues. The pushing of foreign joint venture partners to sign contracts that include the transfer of intellectual property as a precondition for the contract, a contract that provides access to the largest domestic Chinese market. Finally, there are huge sections of the Chinese economy that are still closed to foreign competition. So all of those things, all those trends really started before the United States turned against traditional free trade policies in 2017. They started in China under Hu Jintao, with a program in 2006 when I was in the U.S. State Department as an official called Indigenous Innovation. And this tendency to try to emphasize Chinese businesses over foreign businesses accelerated after the 2008 financial crisis, which I think was a big moment in world history. Under Xi Jinping, it has accelerated much further with policies like Made in China 2025, and even self-reliance, a term that I didn't expect to see so often in Chinese politics because it's a term that was associated with the very disastrous 1958 policies of the Great Leap Forward, which led to 30 to 40 million excess deaths in China. But it's been used more frequently in Chinese politics in recent years. So what happened is China used to have big trade surpluses with the United States and with Europe, and it had trade deficits with its neighbors because it was importing lots of the parts, the supply parts in this transnational production chain. And what happened about 15 years ago, this began to change. Now China has trade surpluses with almost all of its neighbors. This is a very big change, including the Republic of Korea. And I'll talk about those statistics later in my talk, in my speech, and I'll show relevant graphs to demonstrate this pattern. Last year, 2024, facing big challenges at home for economic growth related to problems in the real estate sector and the lack of domestic consumption, China relied more heavily than in the past on exports to spark growth. And China had a $1 trillion trade surplus with the world. This is historically unprecedented, and I believe it's unsustainable. So China's going to have to make adjustments, it seems to me, in this kind of growth model. And this heavy reliance on exports for growth has continued, I understand, into this year. In my own opinion, and it's an outdated opinion in American politics on both sides of the aisle, the best way for the United States and others to deal with these challenges of Chinese economic policy is to negotiate multilaterally with China, like-minded states negotiating multilaterally with China, and bilaterally with China to try to reduce the obstacles for trade. Again, these types of free trade efforts and multilateral efforts are not very popular in U.S. politics. There's little support for it in either major party in the United States. I just, as a personal note, I am an independent. I served in a Republican administration, the George W. Bush administration. But I see this in both the Republican and Democratic Party that nobody has a stomach for multilateralism and free trade negotiations. Instead, we've seen a more steady push for protectionism and more government intervention in economics, not just in the United States, but in multiple countries that used to participate in those multilateral economic negotiations. So first I want to talk a bit about U.S. policies towards China now since 2017, and what they mean for third countries like the Republic of Korea. When Donald Trump ran for office for the first time for the presidency in 2016, he promised to raise bilateral tariffs on China. At the time, I argued that if the United States raised bilateral tariffs on China, the biggest beneficiaries would not be U.S. workers, but would be workers in places like Vietnam, Mexico, and Indonesia. At that time in 2016, there were many people calling for decoupling, total decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies, and there were certain people in the Trump camp who believed in that goal. So far, these voices have not won out in the first Trump administration, in the Biden administration, or in the second Trump administration. They have not won out, but they still exist in U.S. politics. So President Trump raised significant tariffs against China in 2018, keeping his campaign promise to do so. But at that time, 2018 to early 2020, his administration was negotiating with the Chinese to reduce barriers to trade and to increase trade. That shows to me that President Trump did not believe in decoupling, even if some of his advisors believed in decoupling. And there was a phase one trade deal in early 2020 that many people forget. And that's because the COVID pandemic broke out right after it. So the COVID pandemic basically destroyed any progress in U.S.-China relations in 2020. When the Biden administration came into office, they also did not advocate decoupling, emphasizing instead de-risking. But they kept the Trump tariffs in place, and they added new restrictions on exports of high-end semiconductors, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Those restrictions on technology transfers to China were called a small yard with a high fence. Of course, the yard can always grow, and if it grows too much, it moves in the direction of decoupling, but the initial incentive was a small yard around a high fence of certain technologies. There were real precedents for this type of technological export restriction on China. We had them when I served in the Bush administration. We did not sell certain equipment to China that might accelerate military modernization. One of the technologies I remember was equipment that can make turbofan jet engines, a very useful commercial skill set to have for an economy, but one that has very clear military implications. The high-end semiconductor and high-end semiconductor manufacturing equipment restrictions fit into this type, so they are not fundamentally new, because the next generation of weapons is going to rely very heavily on artificial intelligence, and those types of products can accelerate China's ability to apply artificial intelligence to those weapon systems. To have these types of restrictions, the United States needs cooperation from other producers of high-end semiconductors and the equipment to make them, including Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands. But there's something about this type of policy, and I remember this from when I was in the government. It's not a sanction. It's not designed to change Chinese behavior. There's nothing the PRC can do generally for this type of policy to change it by changing its behavior. It's not a tool for negotiations and trade. It's designed to keep the Chinese military from modernizing even faster than it otherwise would. So things got muddy on this score in this year because during the trade tensions that were sparked after quote-unquote Liberation Day in the Trump administration's tariff policy, there were increasing tensions in U.S.-China relations, and the Trump administration added the NVIDIA H20 chip to the list of restricted exports. And then as tensions eased in U.S.-China relations on trade issues and things steadied out at a lower level than at the peak in the spring, the Trump administration lifted the restrictions on H20 NVIDIA chips. And I think what that did was cloud the distinction between tariffs for negotiation purposes, for opening up markets, and these national security restrictions that are related to weapons. So this opens up the possibility that the Chinese side will now insist on the removal of other restrictions on high-end semiconductors and high-end semiconductor manufacturing equipment. If we look at trade, not just export restrictions, as a candidate for president, Joseph Biden said that he was opposed to the Trump administration's 2018 to 2019 tariffs, that they were more damaging to the United States than they were to China. But he kept the tariffs in place. And you can draw your own judgments on this, but my strong sense is that at least some of the tariffs he would have lifted, but I think nobody in American politics wants to look soft on China, and that would have been a source of criticism or a reason for his opponents to criticize him. So those restrictions all stayed in place, and the Biden administration claimed that this was not a goal of decoupling. Again, it was a desire to de-risk, to reduce overdependence on China as a source of products. And they could refer, because the pandemic had already started, to the COVID pandemic and the fact that the United States really did discover that it was overdependent on certain suppliers for key products necessary for the country. My own view, again, which is a little bit outdated, is that the simplest solution to over-reliance on a single source of supply is to negotiate more trade with more actors. So you're not reliant on one actor, you can import from multiple sources. And this should be an incentive, again, for multilateral international negotiations and agreements. But again, this is very unpopular in the United States these days, and I'm a bit of an outlier in American political spectrum on these issues. So often the proposed replacement of foreign producers in the United States are somewhat protectionist measures to produce the products at home, and this becomes a source of potential friction with trade partners, both allies and partners. So in Trump 2.0, since 2025, when President Trump took office again, Treasury Secretary Bessent has said that the Trump administration also opposes decoupling. And last week, he said something significant. He said the Trump administration seeks de-risking, not decoupling. Why is that significant? That is a phrase from the Biden administration. So they're using the same phraseology now as the Biden administration, which really strongly suggests that those advocates in the contemporary Republican Party who want decoupling are not winning the day. And I think they're right to reject decoupling, because decoupling would be bad for security strategy in a way that is not always appreciated in the journalistic literature or even the academic literature. To the degree that countries like the United States and East Asian allies and partners decouple from the PRC, this reduces the cost of military conflict over the many disputes in the region, and I believe would increase the likelihood of conflict over those issues. So what happened when the United States raised these tariffs internationally, when the United States in 2018 first raised the tariffs that persisted to this day? And I want to show you what didn't happen. What didn't happen is a reduction in the U.S. trade deficit with the world, which continued to go up, even as the U.S. trade deficit with China went down. And what this meant is you had a larger U.S. trade deficit with the world, but the percentage of the overall U.S. trade deficit with China, the overall trade deficit with the world constituted by the deficit with China would go down sharply, and you can see that in this graph. But there was frustration among Americans who thought that the tariffs against China would reduce U.S. dependence on foreign trade and create lots of jobs for U.S. workers. And one of the reasons they were frustrated, and it was predictable back in 2016, I can say that because I predicted it, is that final production from China moved to other countries. And that became a source of frustration for the Trump administration as it came back into office. And they have come up with two solutions to that policy, which is you can't just raise tariffs on China, you have to raise tariffs on the world. And we saw that on April 2nd, 2025 with the Liberation Day tariffs. And then there's another measure, which I will talk about later in the speech, about how to handle countries that produce products with significant Chinese value in them. And that is enhanced tariffs against the transshipment from China to third countries. And this could have big implications for Korea. Chinese companies and companies from third countries that used to produce in China have moved production to places like Vietnam and Mexico. Many of the parts and the final products are still produced in China and exported to countries like Mexico and Vietnam. And the U.S. is often the final market for those final products. So it is my opinion that the United States consumer is still consuming as much Chinese value in imported products as before the tariffs were leveled. And this is a source of frustration. And I'll try to demonstrate that to you with some graphs. So here we have, from the time of the 2018 tariffs against China to 2024 last year, this is the increase in the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam. And it goes from around 35 to 40 billion up to 123 to 25 billion, depending on which statistics you use. And we see a similar pattern in the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico, from around 80 billion to over 170 billion, some people say 180 billion US dollars in that same period. And if you think this is just coincidental, that the trade deficit with China went down and these went up, I created this slide. China's trade with Vietnam increased sharply, exports to Vietnam increased sharply, and the Chinese trade surplus with Vietnam increased sharply in the same period. And Chinese firms moved their final production to these countries, and so did third country producers. I went to Vietnam last year, and I talked to people in Vietnam, and they pointed out that Samsung now produces 80% of its cell phones sold around the world in Vietnam. And when I was there, it was the fall of last year, just before the election, there was a group of congressional staffers that had arrived in Vietnam to study this phenomenon, the phenomenon of Chinese value being shipped through Vietnam and then back out to the United States. And I think this sent a signal about where Trump administration, if President Trump were elected again, would go with the policy. And we've seen that. And there was a very telling testimony by Secretary Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce in the United States, at the Senate, in which he was asked by a senator that if the Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025 tariffs are reciprocal, and Vietnam drops all of its tariffs on the United States to zero, will the United States drop its tariffs on Vietnam to zero? And Secretary Lutnick's response was very telling. He said, no, we would not reduce our tariffs to zero because there's still the problem of transshipment, the problem of Chinese products being sent through Vietnam, and we have to judge the trade with Vietnam through that lens. Now, I'll say, having worked in the U.S. government, there's no institutional infrastructure in the United States that's ready to try to assess what percentage value of any given product has come from China and then put tariffs on it, but the administration has announced this intention of putting 40%, very high tariffs, on such products. And it's unclear how this policy will actually be implemented. And I think that's important for our purposes here today, and I'll return to it. So how might this all affect Korea and U.S.-Korea relations? Korea has arguably been hurt by Beijing's effort to replace foreign inputs in the global supply chain. So if we look at, I'm sorry, I left this slide out. This is China's trade with Mexico, and you can see the growing trade deficit with Mexico. And I wanted to show this slide as well, because this really shows the relationship between the two sides. So this is a slide that shows Vietnam's trade with the United States and China from 2018 to 2024. And the blue line is United States exports to Vietnam's exports to the United States. That's Vietnam's exports to the United States. And the red line are Chinese exports to Vietnam. And if you look at the slope of these lines, you can see how they are directly related. And that's why I think these congressional staffers who went to Vietnam and Secretary Lutnick is emphasizing in relations with Vietnam this problem of transshipment. So now I'm going to look at South Korean trade with China. Traditionally, you see the blue line, which is ROK exports to China. The red line is Chinese exports to the ROK. We can see a pattern in which the Chinese replacement of inputs into the Chinese transnational production chain has led to a trade deficit in the ROK with China. Not a very large one yet, but a significant change in the overall pattern in the previous years. So here's another graphic that shows the change. And you can see in 2013, Korea enjoyed a very large trade surplus with China. And in recent years, it has fallen into deficit. So Korean firms have turned to the United States in part because the Chinese exports to South Korea have grown very quickly. The opportunities for Korean firms in China have declined quite a bit, and Korean firms have turned to the United States for trade and for foreign direct investment. And here we see the Chinese exports to Korea by type. And the reason I show this slide is that if we look at electrical and electronic equipment, iron and steel, and vehicles and vehicle parts, these are the types of inputs from China that go into Korea's final products that are often exported to the United States. So if the United States is focused on transshipment and the potential for transshipment tariffs, and China's not supplying the same opportunities for Korean firms, and here's a graphic that shows the opportunities that have been lost for Hyundai since 2016 in China, with 41% drop in sales in the last year-on-year measure in 2024. You see the U.S. trade deficit with South Korea in the same period going up sharply, 200%. So I think this is likely to be on the radar screen of American policymakers. They look at the types of Chinese products that are still being sold to Korea, creating a trade surplus with Korea from China. They look at the kinds of products that are being sold in the United States. And they might conclude that this is an example of transshipment. Right? If we look at the breakdown of South Korean exports, Republic of Korea exports to the United States, you can see that they are of the types of products that easily could include Chinese inputs that I showed you earlier, particularly in the automotive sector and the electrical equipment and semiconductor sector. Machinery as well. So this transshipment issue is going to be a complicated one for the United States and for U.S. ROK relations, and I'll return to that in a moment. There's another aspect of U.S. U.S.-China relations and China's relations with the outside world, where security politics and economics are clearly very linked. And that is the issue of rare earths. And this is the hot topic of the month because of the Ministry of Commerce in China's recent restrictions on trade of sale of rare earths and rare earth magnets and equipment to mine and process rare earths to multiple countries. China predictably has responded to high U.S. tariffs and increased export controls by restricting exports of rare earths and rare earth magnets because China has a tight chokehold on the market for rare earths and rare earth products. Everyone is dependent on China to some degree, but if we look at this chart, you can see that South Korea is extraordinarily, Republic of Korea is extraordinarily dependent on China for rare earth exports. And the U.S. is quite dependent too. And if you want the link to security politics, here's the U.S. Department of Defense dependence on Chinese rare earth exports. And these are the various military services dependence on rare earth exports from China for weapons production. But as we saw in the earlier slide, Korea is even more dependent. And one of the problems, and this graph is very telling, one of the problems is that when the US and China get into economic tensions and there's tariff raising and there's escalation, China moves to restrict exports of rare earths to the United States. And when that happens, there is what would be called in military terms collateral damage for third countries. Third countries get hurt by the rare earth export restrictions of China. And if you look at what happened in April of this year, after the Liberation Day tariffs were put in place, you can see that the exports dropped precipitously, not just to the United States, but also to Korea and Japan. And you can see where easing of U.S.-China economic tensions and the kind of thaw that came in the late spring led to a very quick increase in exports of rare earths to the United States, but also to Japan and South Korea. So South Korea needs to pay very close attention. The Republic of Korea needs to pay very close attention to the tenor and tone of U.S.-China economic relations, because what China does to the United States, it often does to its allies and partners. In October, as I said, China's Ministry of Commerce put on very strict controls on exports and targeting third countries with export restrictions. Those third countries trade with China's real target in this effort, which is the United States and its allies and partners, which would include the ROK. And this is probably a Chinese response to high tariffs, to expanded export restrictions against more Chinese entities, and also a response to the U.S. targeting of third countries with transshipment tariffs, which China objects to strongly. So if we look at the rare earth issue, there is a potential solution, and this is a photograph of a Japanese government entourage that went to Australia to negotiate an agreement with an Australian firm to produce heavy metal rare earths in Australia. Why do I show this? Because Japan was the first country to be hit by rare earth export restrictions in 2010, when Japan and China had a clash over a Chinese fishing boat that had rammed a Japan Coast Guard ship near the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Japan took actions in the interim to reduce dependency on China, and this is something that I think is a kind of a lesson or a potential model for other countries faced with the potential of rare earth export cutoff. We all need to do better on this score, in my opinion. It's a major national security issue for all of our countries, and China has given us a wake-up call with this threatened new restriction set. And we'll see if that threatened new restriction set survives the APEC meeting and the discussions that will likely occur. between President Trump and President Xi. There's another connection between security and economics in East Asia, and that is foreign direct investment into the United States. I said before that opportunities in China for companies like Hyundai have been drying up because of Chinese policies, and Korea has turned very heavily toward the United States as a market, and we saw that with the growing trade deficit, but also in the investment field, which is quite welcome in the United States. And in some years, Korea has been the largest foreign direct investor in the United States, and it's always been close to the top in the recent years. One of the reasons that President Trump claimed on Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025, what he called Liberation Day, for raising the tariffs was to encourage foreign direct investment into the United States. So I think in the Trump administration, this type of investment is quite attractive and desirable. The goal is to create U.S. jobs, to reverse some of the offshoring of jobs that they envisioned the United States doing in the earlier period. But there's another aspect that has direct relations to security, and that is the desire to rebuild strategic U.S. industries that are related to U.S. national security. And the Republic of Korea is in a very good position to do both, to invest in the United States producing jobs and to invest in strategic industries. And here's a photograph of President Lee's quite successful trip to Washington, talking to President Trump. I had the pleasure of seeing President Lee speak at CSIS after his meeting with President Trump that day. And they discussed Korean investment in the shipbuilding industry. The U.S. shipbuilding industry has become very anemic. It's a very weak competitive position in comparison to China, which is very strong in shipbuilding. Korea is very strong in shipbuilding. Japan is very strong in shipbuilding. And this is a potential source of cooperation between the United States and Korea and the United States and Japan moving forward. There's a problem in the United States on regulations. There are domestic regulations and laws that prevent the United States from being competitive in the shipbuilding industry. One is the Jones Act, which requires U.S. shippers who ship between U.S. ports within the United States to use only U.S.-made ships. A second is a restriction in the Department of Defense against any foreign participation in the creation of warships. And I think these will be addressed, and I'll talk about that later. I don't think that those are necessarily permanent policies, but they are a part of the problem. So the investment is welcome in the United States, but there was a big problem. And there's no doubt that there was a big problem, and that was the raid on the Hyundai plant by federal law enforcement forces and arresting hundreds of workers, many of them Korean, skilled workers, who were building a plant that would eventually hire Americans. And this led to a predictably negative reaction in Korea, with 6 in 10 Koreans being disappointed in their ally, the United States, over this Georgia raid. This is all understandable, in my opinion, but I'm trying today to say to you that this could be a very positive factor in the future. It's hard to imagine how something this upsetting could be a positive factor, but here is why I think it's a positive factor. I believe, as an outside analyst, I'm not inside the Trump administration, that 2 Trump administration policies ran into each other head-on unintentionally. You had a policy to restrict illegal immigration in the United States. That was one policy line. You had another set of policies designed to increase foreign direct investment in the United States, and these 2 policies crashed into each other at that Hyundai plant in Georgia. It's especially worrying in the Hyundai case when something like this happens, because the Hyundai plant was not only going to hire Americans, as I said before, but was going to help the United States produce electric batteries, which are a huge competitive advantage of China over the United States at present. So it was related to the strategic competition with China. So why do I say that this could turn out to be a positive factor in the end, such an unhappy event? The Trump administration rarely apologizes for anything. It's not really how they operate. And President Trump himself almost never apologizes for a policy decision that he made. But President Trump came pretty close online to apologizing for the Hyundai plant raid. And my understanding is Deputy Secretary of State Landau came to Korea and expressed regret over the Hyundai plant raid and signaled to the Korean government that the administration will be working to reduce the difficulties that skilled workers have in gaining the proper visa permissions to work in the United States. So it was a kind of a shock, and it can be a shock that produces a positive long-term result if the Trump administration sees how these policies are running into each other. And I think it's an invitation for Korean business leaders like in this room to discuss with the U.S. government the nature of the foreign direct investment, why it's important to the United States, and why skilled workers need to be sent to support those foreign direct investments, and why the United States needs to make it easier, not harder, for those skilled workers to operate in the United States. And I think this will be particularly important on shipbuilding, because shipbuilding is so important strategically in the security realm for the United States, that there ought to be constructive ways to negotiate and arrange for better treatment of skilled Korean workers who come to the United States. And I do think the United States will eventually do something about that Jones Act that I talked about before, and the restrictions on foreign participation in the building of military ships. Because Korea is a close and loyal ally of the United States, there's no reason why Korean shipbuilders can't be involved in those processes, and I think people will come to that conclusion over time. Now, the United States and the ROK have a long-term strategic relationship. We face common challenges from authoritarian regimes. Here you see Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin at the recent celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory over Imperial Japan. Missing from this picture, I would say, is the Iranian leadership, and I would include the Iranian leadership in this group of authoritarian leaders that pose a challenge to both of our countries' security over time. I can't help but think that security cooperation between the United States and the ROK facing these common challenges will not be a positive factor in economic negotiations moving forward. It's only natural that if the U.S. and the ROK are cooperating actively on security, that it will reduce the overall tensions in the relationship, improve the environment in the relationship, and this will have implications for U.S. policy towards Korea directly on issues that are very important to Korea, like Korea currently has a 25% auto tax, whereas Japan and Germany have 15%. So maybe this type of thing would be more easy. It'd be easier to deal with such problems if the U.S.-ROK security relationship is in a good place than otherwise. And I also think, as I said before, the transshipment tariffs are a new policy without an institutional infrastructure, or standard operating procedures. So I think if the U.S.-ROK security relationship is in good shape, the interpretation of that new policy agenda will be different than if U.S.-ROK security relations are not in good shape. So there's a problem for China with its relationships. China is still, despite the efforts that it's made to reduce dependence on the outside world, it is still highly integrated in the international economy. It still depends very heavily on the international economy, as we saw with that $1 trillion trade surplus with the world last year that helped keep growth going. But China's authoritarian partners are not as linked to the international economy. And this is in what we call in political science a variable. So I said before that transnational production and integration were a force for peace. That means if you don't have transnational production and integration, that's a force for potential conflict. And what's happened to China is, I believe, China has watched its authoritarian partners destabilize regions and cause conflicts. And the problem for China, and the problem for all of us, is China always has their back when they do. So China always supports these countries when they do these things. And that creates huge problems in China's overall diplomacy with Europe, with the United States and others. And this phenomenon of straining China's relations with countries like the United States is worse if the overall US-China bilateral relationship is already bad. So if President Trump continues to get frustrated with President Putin over his invasion of Ukraine, you could imagine the United States raising secondary sanctions against China. President Trump's favorite secondary sanction is tariffs. If the United States raises tariffs for this reason against China, China will likely retaliate in ways that will have implications not just for the United States, but for Korea and Japan, as we saw in the example of the rare earth metals graph that I earlier showed you. The same could be true for Iran. China has a long-term economic and security relationship with Iran. The Iranian military has been severely damaged by Israel and then by a strike by the United States. And the Iranian military is probably going to want to rebuild. And then an open question is, will China help in that process? And if China helps in that process in a kind of secretive way, it appears that Iran is heavily penetrated by foreign intelligence, and it may become discovered. If that happens, the Trump administration, again, might put secondary sanctions on China because of its relationship with Iran, and we can predict, China experts would expect, China to retaliate against the United States in various areas like rare earths or tariffs in ways that would impact third countries like Korea. Another place where all of this comes to a head is on U.S. strategy in East Asia, as a military and security strategy in East Asia, and changes in it. The United States doctrine in East Asia is changing. The United States is trying to create a more distributed, mobile, and agile force to take on challenges, not just China, but for China as well. And that requires access to new places and new purposes for existing forces in the region. And the reason for this is not an argument, it's convincing, is that fixed U.S. bases, the traditional U.S. presence in East Asia, fixed large bases in places like Japan and Korea, are too vulnerable to Chinese strikes. China has too many strike weapons, long-range strike weapons. So U.S. forces have to be mobile and nimble and be able to move around to provide the traditional deterrence role that I believe the United States has played in this region, which is another reason why there hasn't been a war since 1979, in addition to transnational production. But that kind of additional access or new roles for U.S. forces in the region are often very controversial in the countries in question, and most of the U.S. allies and partners are democracies, so it feeds into democratic politics in the various countries. So it's not good, in my opinion, when U.S. economic policy, policies of raising tariffs to encourage investment in the United States and produce jobs in the United States, runs against the national security doctrines that are being developed for East Asia. When they run against each other, that is not good. And when U.S. policy towards one region of the world undercuts support in the other region of the world for the U.S. alliance system, that is also a potential issue. So I'll show you a slide here. This is a slide from Korea. It's a public opinion poll in Korea in March of 2025, so before the Liberation Day tariffs, but after the United States seemingly changed positions on the Russian war in Ukraine. And you see that there's a growth in the number of people who distrust the United States as an ally in Korea, and a reduction in the number of people who trust the United States as an ally. And then the second graph is from Taiwan it's from April of 2025, after the Liberation Day tariffs. Liberation Day tariffs were raised against many countries and actors around the world, and Taiwan was slapped with relatively high tariffs as part of that program. And you can see that in Taiwan, the United States is a trusted security partner. The trust was reduced, and those who distrust the United States increased in numbers. So this is important, how all these policies fit together from an American perspective. And one of the reasons I'm concerned about all of the tariffs that have been raised on U.S. allies and partners is I'm not sure they fit very cleanly into a strategy that is going to ask more of those allies and partners as part of this new distributed mobile doctrine that the United States is using on all of the services of the United States military in the region. When it comes to Republic of Korea, there is a controversial aspect of this doctrine, and that is traditionally Seoul has wanted the United States forces in Korea to focus on one thing and one thing only, which is the threat from North Korea, and not other contingencies in the East Asia region. And of course, the United States is concerned about North Korea, so the United States doesn't need to be convinced to be concerned about North Korea. But I think the United States is going to ask two things of Republic of Korea that are potentially controversial in domestic politics here. And I'll show you, when you look at this graph, these are democracies. These are just the party breakdowns of those earlier graphs. So it depends on which party you're dealing with. It depends on who's in power. So the United States needs, I think, to be sensitive to these types of issues. But the United States is almost certainly going to ask Korea for two things in the security realm. One is a greater contribution to the overall alliance effort in deterring North Korea. And the second is probably more controversial because I think the Republic of Korea can increase its contribution to the alliance. And that is allowing U.S. forces in Korea to be part of this distributed mobile network of forces in East Asia and potentially operating off of the Korean Peninsula in time of conflict. I think if the Republic of Korea resists these efforts from the Trump administration moving forward, the U.S. ROK alliance will look less important, all things being equal, to the United States. And I think this will have implications for the economic relations bilaterally with Korea, and it will also have implications for how those transshipment tariffs are interpreted moving forward, because again, they lack that kind of institutional infrastructure, and they lack standard operating procedures, so there'll be a lot of interpretation in how those things are applied moving forward. So economics and security are linked. I hope I demonstrated that from the beginning of the talk through this moment. And I think that the U.S.-ROK relationship is important to both countries. I think we face new challenges. I was asked to offer recommendation to Korean business leaders, and I will do that. They take two forms. One is what to watch in international politics, kind of political risk analysis that your companies ought to be doing to understand what's happening in the world and how it might impact your businesses. And the second is what to do, what actions to adopt to improve the prospects for the ROK's economics and security moving forward. So, what to watch? Watch U.S.-China trade tensions. They could lead to Chinese measures that hurt Korean interests, such as persistent rare earth export restrictions, and any kind of increase in U.S.-China trade tensions is likely to manifest itself in stricter and more rigorous application of those 40% transshipment tariffs that could have an impact on Korean businesses in exports to the United States. I think that Korean business leaders should also study how transshipment tariffs are being applied over time in places like Vietnam. And we showed before how the relationship between Vietnam, China, and the United States are directly linked. The slopes of those curves are not coincidental. So there'll be a lot of attention to countries like Vietnam and Mexico on the So study how it's being applied, what rules are being used and created, what standard operating procedures are being created, and how might that affect your business. Look at U.S.-China overall relations and try to determine the likelihood of U.S. secondary sanctions, as I discussed before, over issues like China, like Russia, invasion of Ukraine, like Iranian military rebuilding in the Middle East, or North Korea. North Korea could cause difficulties not just for South Korea and the United States, but could also cause difficulties for the U.S.-China relationship if China decides to support North Korea in some kind of future aggressive policy. So a second thing would, a related thing is that if there are secondary tariffs on China over these issues, secondary sanctions on China over these issues in the form of tariffs, China is likely to respond as it has in the past by restricting rare earth magnets and rare earth materials, and not just the United States, but allies and partners are affected. And then finally, and this is the scariest moment, and that is follow U.S.-China relations to see the likelihood of a conflict. If there is a conflict between the United States and China over the South China Sea, over the East China Sea, over the Senkaku-Diaoyu dispute, or more likely and more devastatingly over Taiwan, this would have a huge impact on all businesses in East Asia and around the world. And you can be sure that in a time of conflict, if your economic relations with China have not been cut off by the conflict itself, that the U.S. government will be pressuring the Republic of Korea to reduce economic interactions with China under that kind of harsh political environment. So I would urge your political risk analysts to look at those problems. So what is to be done? What to do? On rare earths, I think it's really essential that the Republic of Korea reduce its overall dependency on China for the sole supply of rare earths. And one thing the Republic of Korea can do, using the Japan model, is to cooperate with others, Australia, the United States, and Japan, to diversify supplies. There's going to be a lot of attention to this in the United States after the recent Ministry of Commerce measures that were threatened or announced. This second one is a little bit more controversial. I showed how Chinese inputs look like they're heavily involved in Korean exports to the United States. To the degree it's possible, reduce the percentage of Chinese value in the products exported to the United States by diversifying the supply chain of products that come into your business for products made to the United States. This is not decoupling. We don't need decoupling in rare earths. We can still buy lots of rare earths and rare earth magnets from China. You shouldn't be overly reliant on one source, and you certainly shouldn't be overly reliant on one source that could be an adversary in the future in a conflict. So reducing overdependence doesn't mean decoupling. And as I said earlier in the talk, I think decoupling would be bad. But creating more sources is better. And that's true also for the inputs in exports to the United States. And I think since those transshipment tariffs are being interpreted for the first time and the rules are being created for the first time, I think if the Republic of Korea companies could signal to the United States that they're reducing dependence, that the trend lines are moving in that direction, that very, very rigorous and strict enforcement of transshipment tariffs might be reduced as well, because it will create an environment. This is a cooperative actor. So develop domestic or third country supply chains for those products. And then finally, there's in the security realm, we first have the idea that Korea needs to invest more in the United States. And as I said earlier, I strongly believe that the Hyundai raid is seen in the United States as a big mistake, and that the United States is open to working with Korean firms and the ROK government and other governments to make it easier for skilled workers to come in support of foreign direct investment, because that is a big part of the Trump administration's strategy. So I think this is an opportunity for improvement of conditions because of that terrible event. But when Korean firms invest in the United States, try to employ as many U.S. citizens as possible. And I know that it's a problem. The U.S. has a shortage of skilled workers in certain areas. But one thing Korean companies can do is immediately start to train U.S. workers for the long run so that they can be employed by these factories. That would be a great way to improve U.S. ROK relations. And then finally, on security cooperation, and I think this is really important, and I do believe it's related to economics. It's very important for the overall U.S.-ROK relationship, for the ROK to contribute to and participate in this new military approach to the region. It allows the United States to have a stronger role in the region, and I believe that the U.S. presence, military presence in East Asia, the strong U.S. military presence in East Asia, is one of the main reasons that there has been no interstate conflict in East Asia since 1979. The U.S.-ROK alliance is a big part of that, and the U.S.-ROK alliance needs to stay a big part of that, but the U.S. strategy is changing. So it's important for the Republic of Korea to change with the U.S. strategy and allow flexible use of U.S. forces in Korea for operations outside of Korea as part of that network, and to contribute as much as possible to the overall U.S.-ROK alliance strategy against North Korea. And I think that provides very strong incentives for U.S. policymakers to ease economic tensions between the U.S.-ROK over things like bilateral tariffs. And I think it also reduces the likelihood that there'll be very strict interpretation of transshipment tariffs against Chinese firms selling to the United States, because the U.S.-ROK security relationship will be more valued, even more valued than it has been in the past. And I think that that can have a very positive effect on the economic front as well. I've spoken for too long. Those are my pieces of advice for Korean businesses. I think they flow from the analysis of the relationship between economic security in the region and security politics in the region. And I look forward to Dr. Bong's moderation and the questions. And thank you for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I hope my presentation was clear. Thank you.